Hello, and welcome to my review of the very first PSP game that I've ever played, which is also one of the biggest reasons why I got a PSP just a few months ago, and that game is Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII. Now, this is a game that I've pretty much been interested in ever since I beat Final Fantasy VII, which was only like 5 years ago now. And yeah, I've been really interested in it ever since then because I fell in love with Final Fantasy VII. It instantly became one of my favorite games I've ever played, and the only thing that kept me from it was, of course, that it was on PSP only. But I finally got a PSP, and played through it, beat it just a few days ago, and I am finally able to give my review on this prequel to Final Fantasy VII. And I'll vaguely hint at a few things from Final Fantasy VII's story in this review, but I'll try to avoid getting into specific plot details that would give away that story. So this review and this game are really geared towards people who've played Final Fantasy VII. This game will hint at a lot of obscure things in that game, because it was released after Final Fantasy VII, so it's definitely going to be most easy to appreciate this game in full if you've played that game, that classic Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 1 that everybody raves about so much, and which I rave about as well. So I'll start things off reflecting on the story and characters of Crisis Core. And I've got to say, the story of this game is pretty darn good. It's told from the perspective of Zack, who is a character we're only vaguely introduced to in Final Fantasy VII, of course, if you really looked into Cloud's backstory in that game and found out some nuggets about Cloud's past. And it's a really compelling perspective of Zack's journey, and you just are really made to feel everything that he feels throughout his just roller coaster emotional time in Shinra's soldier group. And you get quite a bit of the backstory from Final Fantasy VII explored in more detail in this game. Things from Cloud's memories, particularly. And there are also a few things that come up that are unique to Zack's experiences, which are kind of additional story elements that are brought in to sort of fill out the rest of this game, because there wasn't quite enough in just Zack and Cloud's story from Final Fantasy VII to comprise a whole game. They kind of needed to add some additional story elements. And so it's a pretty good mix of new and old. You'll go to a lot of new locations as well as familiar locations, like Midgar and Nibelheim. Familiar places from the world of Gaia in Final Fantasy VII. And you'll also meet a lot of the same old characters you'll remember from that game. The Turks, Aerith, Hojo, Cloud, of course. And the dialogue between all these characters as they're interacting was really strong, I thought. It was just a really well-written, well-told story overall. One thing I will say, though, is that, okay, I thoroughly enjoyed the retracing in further detail of events in this game from Final Fantasy VII, from Cloud's past. Like, anytime the story was progressing through those plot details that were already hinted at in FF7, I was thoroughly engaged in the story and wanted to know what was going to happen next and wanted to drive the story forward. But the new story elements, I cannot say were as good. And it really goes for the new characters introduced as well. There are like a couple new characters introduced as like part of Soldier, Angeal and Genesis, namely. They're the two big ones. And like their personal relationships with Zack and Sephiroth were, you know, pretty heartfelt, pretty emotional in nature, but their roles in this story and the conflicts that they create, in addition to what we were already familiar with in FF7, just seemed pretty weak to me, to be honest. And the issue I had was that their place in the story, like, their motivations for what they did, I felt were pretty fluid and flimsy. Like, Genesis and Angeal, these two characters I'm talking about, it seemed to me like their reasoning for what they did throughout this game was constantly sort of in flux and subject to change, and their like lack of a clear idea of what they were doing and what they wanted in this game's story, in combination with them being characters who we just don't have as much background on because, you know, we don't have any previous background to draw on from FF7. They're characters that we wouldn't even have known existed without this game as a prequel. You know, they just did not make for very compelling characters to me, and anytime their story elements popped up in the game, and this happened especially towards the end in the pacing of the plot, it just felt like a bothersome interruption to me from driving forward with the story of Zack and Cloud, which to me is a much more compelling, much more just well-developed story with a much more clear direction. And so, yeah, that's what I'll say about the story and characters. Like, the old stuff from FF7 was great. The new stuff that's novel to Crisis Core, it didn't do so much for me. But that said, as a whole, and for the majority of my time going through this game's story, I really liked it. And, you know, it's already got the premise of Final Fantasy VII going for it, with just the excellent sci-fi story in that game, and everything involving Sephiroth and Jenova and Shinra. So, it was still strong. The plot in the game is still strong, and it'll keep you playing. It kept me playing to the end, definitely, despite the few weaknesses. So now we'll get into gameplay. So Crisis Core is an action RPG, as people may have heard, and it's a pretty well done action RPG, I think. You basically have random battles that your character, Zack's the only one you play as throughout the whole game, can get into. And battle does not take too long to pick up at all. It's pretty intuitive and easy. You just have one button to do an action in battle, and you just cycle with the L and R buttons on the PSP through available actions you can select, such as your melee attack with your sword, or various magic, which come from materia you equip. Yes, there are materia in this game, just like the original FF7. And also, with a couple other buttons, you can dodge out of the way of enemy attacks or block. And it was overall pretty fun. Like the main melee attack you have with your sword isn't like really a one-to-one responsive action kind of control, and what I mean by that is, like, you'll press the button for attack and Zack will kind of have a delay before he attacks, and you can actually be across from an enemy, across a field, and press attack, and Zack will just run over to them and attack them. Like, so it's not like one-to-one really responsive action combat, but it's still fun. And the magic you use, the materia, like for your thunder and ice spells and whatnot, that is more responsive. So you pretty much choose those commands, press the button, and lightning will zap at your enemy and electrocute them and stuff. It's pretty fun. I should mention as well, the combat in this game has auto-targeting. So the way it works is very simple, and I like it. What happens is you basically auto-target your nearest enemy in a battle, and you don't have to worry about like aiming for them at all. You'll just automatically hit them with either your sword attack or your magic. So that simplified things and made it pretty nice. Let's see what else. So the materia, I'll touch on that just briefly, how materia is handled in this game. Number one, there's a ton of materia. Like almost every materia, I think, that you found in FF7, plus a few new ones, appear in this game. And also, there is something called materia fusion, which I only messed with briefly, where you can fuse two materia into a new materia and make crazy new ones that have new effects. Like I fused once an ice materia and a poison materia and made this dark ice materia that like has an ice attack and also gives status ailments to your enemies. So you can do stuff like that, and it seemed like a pretty deep system of materia fusion, and I didn't mess with it extensively, but that's definitely there for people who want to do that. Another one or two things I'll mention about the combat real quick. There's something called a digital mind wave in this game. Sounds crazy, but it's this. What it is essentially is these 3 spinning slots that appear in the upper left portion of your screen, which would be right here in this video from your perspective. And they're constantly spinning. They have 3 slots for character portraits, 3 slots for numbers, and they just constantly spin throughout every battle, and basically they stop time to time, and you have all sorts of effects they can bring about in battle. Things like battle bonuses, like having your magic not require any SP or MP, excuse me, having your ability points be unlimited, having invincibility happen to Zack so he just can't die for a brief period. Other things that can happen are you can get summons this way. Summons and special attacks. And the summons are, of course, from familiar, monsters that you summon from FF7, like Ifrit and Odin and whatnot. And the other thing that happens with these DMW slots are you level up by getting 777s. And initially I was skeptical of how this would work, because I thought, oh, well, how am I ever going to level up enough if it, leveling up is just a random event of scoring 3 sevens in the DMW. But surprisingly, it worked pretty well, and the rules of probability generally made me level up very regularly in the battles, and once or twice I even leveled up like twice consecutively in one battle, so yeah, it's not a problem. And honestly, having the whole DMW system in place for leveling up in this game, I didn't mind it because it was pretty refreshing not to have to deal with experience points. Like, just, it felt like winning the lottery every time you leveled up, instead of having it be a literal grind of, level grinding. And I kind of liked, just that it was refreshing and new and nothing I'd seen in any other RPG before, and I didn't have any problems leveling up and getting more experienced and stronger in the game, so it works well. Now on to some basic, game flow type issues, or not issues necessarily, but just the game flow of this gameplay. So it's a fairly linear game. In the main story, you'll pretty much never get a ton of freedom to explore the environments in the game, and they're fully 3D environments. You're going through them with a third-person perspective and walking all over the place and getting into random battles where enemies will just appear out of nowhere. But at least at 1 or 2 points you get a little bit more flexibility to explore, and they're not really terribly interactive 3D environments, but like the best you can do is probably when you're in Midgar and explore like the city up above the plate and in the slums below the plate. So that's probably the most freedom you ever have in the game. And you can also go to the Shinra building since you work for Shinra. Zach does. And there aren't terribly many people you can talk to, and there really aren't even hardly any buildings you can go into. Like, the interaction pretty much just consists of talking to the occasional NPC and getting like these chests that are strewn about the world, which have lots of items in them. And other than that, it's mostly going through the main storyline locations, which are linear, just kind of straight lines, basically. A few of them get slightly more complex and slightly maze-like, not annoyingly slow too much, but yeah, it's sort of comparable to something like Final Fantasy X in terms of the exploration of the environments in this game and the flow of progressing through the storyline. Now, another thing you can do in this game are missions, and these are just, number one, there are tons of missions, just tons and tons. I did so many in this game, but still only managed to do like less than 50% of the total missions that are in it. And the reason I didn't do very many was because, well, honestly, the greatest utility of them was just giving you a chance to get used to the battle system and level up just by virtue of spending more time in combat, because, rules of probability again with the DMW. The longer you got those slots spinning, the greater your chances of getting 3 sevens, the greater your chances of leveling up. So it was really just the utility of having a place to go and get into battles and get that experience. The missions, though, like, I mean, there's not much to them. They're very short, like, think 2 to 5 minutes to complete one, really short. And they take place in these repetitive environments where you'll either have a very simple system of corridors to navigate, or a single wide open field, and all of them, like virtually all of them, simply boil down to finding one enemy and kicking their butt, and then you've won the mission. And there typically isn't much story to these missions other than a very brief synopsis of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Just a little paragraph, and yeah, most of the time there's not much character interaction or development or anything going on with the missions, with a few rare exceptions. So, I mean, the missions are there, and they're an easy way to just get into battles and do little things to make you feel like you're accomplishing something, and you can access them from any save point in the game. And save points are placed pretty frequently throughout the game world, so it's pretty convenient as well. So that's the missions. I think that pretty much sums up everything I need to say about the gameplay. Just before I move on though, I'll mention the game does have like a few attempts, small attempts, in the spirit of the original Final Fantasy VII, I think, to break up the gameplay with a few little mini games or just little odd side quests or activities you can do throughout the main story and some of the locations you come to. And it was sort of hit and miss with them. Like at one point there was this little stealth mission you could do that was part of the main story, and it kind of was a failure. Like, this game is just, the camera and stuff in this game are not very well suited to stealth. But overall, these little like distractions from the main grind of the gameplay were pretty nice to have. They weren't as good as what you find in Final Fantasy VII, like being able to snowboard down a mountain. Like, you're not going to find anything that good in Crisis Core. But there were a few nice little attempts thrown in there, so I give it credit for that. So yeah, that's the gameplay. I guess I'll get into presentation now of Crisis Core, and this is gonna be my favorite thing to talk about because this game is incredible in its presentation. And I'll start by talking about the audio. Number one, the voice acting is stellar, all around stellar. There's lots of voice acting in the cutscenes of this game, and Zack's got a great voice actor. Cloud's got a great voice actor that fits him well. Just really appropriate voice acting that's emotional when it should be, and lighthearted when it should be. Just really great performances, just really rock solid voice work from all the characters in this game, and it just really brought a lot of them to life. And I've got to give special attention to Zack here because the way Zack is written in this game and the way he behaves and his voice actor's performance, they all contribute to make him just a very lovable, pure-hearted, enthusiastic and protagonist that you just can't help but like. Like, Zack is one of the most likable game protagonists I think I've ever seen, and Cloud as well. Zack's character has this really outgoing, kind of friendly voice actor, and Cloud sounds more reserved and shy and not quite as confident in himself. So Yeah, those two in particular, I have to mention, had really great voice work done, but really all the characters in the game did. Aerith was pretty good too. Yeah, great voice work. Sephiroth sounds kind of cold and calculating, and like he doesn't have too much emotion, which is good. That's pretty appropriate for the type of personality I think he has. So great voice acting. But I've got to say the best thing about the audio in this game is the music. Now, this game probably has one of my favorite soundtracks of any game I've ever played, and it competes with the original Final Fantasy VII's for sure. And a part of that is that a lot of the music in this game is, you know, a lot of it consists of rearrangements of Final Fantasy VII tracks, and those tracks are already excellent, wonderful compositions. So it's great to hear those again, but rearranged, kind of remixed in this game. And the remixes are just excellent all around, and the new tracks you hear, like there are new tracks as well that are just totally new compositions, just composed for this game, and those are stellar as well. And both new and old songs in this game, one of the things I really appreciated about them was the variety in instrumentation. And there's just like something of every kind of instrumentation or genre of music that you can imagine almost in this game. Like the battle themes have some killer metal with super heavy like nu metal style guitars, and I love that kind of stuff, so that was great. Just really just dirty, brutal, distorted guitars, just really heavy stuff that you could really rock out to, with pounding drums and all that good stuff. But then you would have just these sweeping orchestral arrangements of songs in this game. You hear lots of strings and piano, and it was just so good, just so stunning and emotionally stirring these pieces were. And in addition to that, you also have like a lot of tracks that have this laid-back rock kind of feel, and the atmosphere is almost Western, like it's almost Western feeling. Like you'll have these clean guitars, kind of echoey, and this laid-back drum beats set to that, and like it reminds me a lot of if anybody is familiar with the soundtracks of Silent Hill 2 and 3, like the rock tracks in those games have a very similar feel to a lot of the music in Crisis Core. Just this like laid back, kind of gritty rock that's a little bit edgy but still like relaxed, and it's just got this good swagger to it, sort of. That's how I would describe it, and it's just a phenomenal soundtrack. Like there aren't any songs I really got tired of hearing, and everything was just varied and like cinematic quality and emotional, like lots of emotional songs as well as stuff that you can rock out to. Phenomenal soundtrack. Just this game is almost worth playing just to hear the soundtrack alone, I think. Or if you don't play this game, you know, look into the soundtrack, because you'll more likely than not find an awesome song that you just like listening to from this soundtrack. The next thing I'll get into is visuals, and this is another soaring high point for this game. The visuals in Crisis Core are stunning. There's no other word I have for it. The 3D environments are beautiful to explore. They look great from a distance and up close. The detail is phenomenal. The character designs are outstanding. Just emotive and dynamic and just very well animated in their movements. And all of this is amplified, of course, in cutscenes, and as well as in like summoning animations for, you know, the summons that you would be familiar with from Final Fantasy VII. Like in those cutscenes and summoning animations, it is out of this world. Like out of this world graphics on your little PSP screen, and it was just a show to watch it all. It was really great to see all that. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my review of Crisis Core, I believe. I'm trying to think if I forgot about anything. Oh yeah, I will mention one thing, one general thing about the story that I forgot to mention, I think, going back now. And this is one thing, just one little complaint I had about the story. If you played Final Fantasy VII and played to the end and saw Sephiroth, you know, in the very end of the game, you'll be familiar with a certain morphological feature sported by the great Sephiroth. And without getting into specifics, let me just say that that particular morphological feature was relied on way too much and sort of just pasted on to any character in this game with no rhyme or reason who could maybe have it. It was just a weak... It was a weak part of the character design, honestly. A very, very weak and lazy part of the character design that I didn't care for. It didn't make a ton of sense at all why you kept seeing it everywhere. And I don't want to get too into specifics, like I said, but yeah, it was one little thing that was just... It became humorous by the end. It became humorous by the end of the game. And speaking of humor, one last little note I'll make on the tone of this game is that the tone, while overall being quite serious, much like the original FF7, it has moments of humor thrown out here and there. And it's not like done to death, but it's got that same little humor streak that FF7 had, where, you know, aside from the main story, if you're going around and talking to NPCs, like, you'll find some funny things that they say, like pretty hilarious things. Just little chuckles here and there. And you get a tiny bit of that from a few of the main characters in the storyline as well, so that was good to see. I mean, I appreciated the balance of serious, grave story elements with humor in the original FF7, so know that that kind of spirit of FF7 is still kept alive in this game. And other things to say, my gameplay clocked in at around 25 hours for this game, which is on the short side for my standards anyway. Good part of that time was spent just doing the missions, which are not required but which will give you battle experience, so you could probably even finish it in quite a bit a shorter time than 25 hours if you chose. But yeah, that's Crisis Core. I do not think that this game lives up to the excellence of the original Final Fantasy VII, but I will say that it is still a very good game, and I would give it a strong recommendation, despite the few tiny complaints I had with it. Super game. Very good. So I recommend it. Peace out.